On June 28, 2015, Dr. Teresa Sievers returned home from a family vacation, unaware that her life was about to be brutally cut short. The horrific murder of an appreciated holistic physician on site in her residence sent ripples of shock into Bonita Springs, Florida, an otherwise tight-knit community. Detectives would later uncover a most remarkable conspiracy involving her husband, Mark Sievers, and two other associates who perpetrated the killing from more than 1,200 miles away. What could make a husband kill his wife in such a violent way? Hi there, I'm Mark and welcome to True Crime Stories. Today we explore the harrowing case of Dr. Teresa Sievers, a story that reveals how love can turn into treachery and how greed can lead to unimaginable violence. How did a devoted mother and a successful doctor become the targets of a murder plot? What dark secrets were hidden behind closed doors? Let's take a look. Dr. Teresa Ann Grace was a holistic physician known for her commitment to patient care. She graduated from Ross University School of Medicine in 1996 and established a medical practice in Bonita Springs, Florida. Teresa was dedicated to blending traditional and alternative medicine, helping patients who had exhausted other treatment options. Mark Douglas Sievers, Teresa's husband, served as the office manager at her practice. They married in 2003 and had two daughters. Initially portrayed as a supportive family man, Mark's actions would later come under scrutiny as the investigation into Teresa's murder unfolded. Financial struggles within the family would emerge as a significant factor in the events that followed. The conspiracy to murder Dr. Teresa Sievers began during the wedding of Curtis Wayne Wright in May 2015. Mark Sievers, attending as a guest, confided in Wright about his mental health issues and expressed fears that Teresa would take their children away. Mark articulated his desire to have Teresa killed, citing financial motivations tied to her life insurance policies. He believed that eliminating her would solve his problems and provide him with the financial security he sought. Initially uncertain about the plan, Wright eventually agreed to assist Mark, indicating that he could handle the situation for a share of the insurance payout. After securing Wright's agreement, Curtis Wayne Wright recruited Jimmy Roy Rogers to assist in the murder plot. Wright promised Rogers a portion of the life insurance money as compensation for his involvement. In his trial testimony, Wright characterized Rogers as someone with a history of violence, stating that he had been involved in other deaths. This portrayal highlights Rogers' willingness to commit murder, making him a suitable accomplice for the planned attack on Teresa. Mark Sievers devised two potential scenarios for executing the murder. The first scenario involved killing Teresa at their home on June 28, making it appear as though a burglary had occurred. To prepare for this option, Mark tested access points to their property, including going over the backyard fence and trimming bushes to create a clear path to the garage. He also instructed Wright on how to enter the house and disable the security system. The second scenario, considered by Mark, involved murdering Teresa at her medical office on June 29, aiming to disguise it as a mugging. He provided Wright with aerial photographs of the building, identifying a secluded stairwell that Teresa often used when leaving work late at night. Mark even shared access codes for this stairwell with Wright, emphasizing that regardless of where the murder took place, it should appear to be an act of robbery or burglary. On June 28, 2015, Dr. Teresa Sievers returned to her home in Bonita Springs, Florida, after cutting short a family vacation in upstate New York. She arrived at Southwest Florida International Airport, where security footage captured her rolling her suitcase through the terminal. After calling her husband Mark to inform him that she was safe, Teresa got into a car and drove home. Unbeknownst to her, two men were waiting inside the house, ready to execute a deadly plan orchestrated by her own husband, Mark, the same person who she had just informed about her safety. Inside the house, Curtis Wayne Wright and Jimmy Roy Rogers lay in wait. They had meticulously planned this moment after weeks of discussion and preparation. As Teresa stepped into the kitchen, Wright ambushed her from behind. He had picked up a hammer from the garage freezer earlier and struck Teresa once in the head. Startled by the sudden attack, she turned to confront her assailant, but was met with another blow. The violence escalated rapidly as Rogers joined in, wielding his own hammer. The two men attacked Teresa with brutal force, striking her repeatedly until she fell to the floor in a pool of blood. Witnesses later described how Teresa fought back instinctively, raising her hands to protect herself from the blows. Despite her efforts, she succumbed to the overwhelming assault, sustaining a total of 17 impact wounds to her head before silence fell in the kitchen. Once they were certain Teresa was dead, Wright and Rogers left the crime scene without activating the alarm system. They had previously disabled it using the knowledge provided by Mark Sievers during their planning discussions. The murder had been executed swiftly and without any immediate evidence of forced entry. They used an unlocked side door to gain access. After committing the crime, Wright and Rogers returned to Missouri in their rental car. They believed they had successfully covered their tracks. Meanwhile, Mark Sievers received alarming news from Dr. Sievers' office early on June 29th. She had not shown up for work. Appearing concerned about his wife's absence, he called a family friend to check in on Teresa at home. This call would lead to the discovery of Teresa's body and set off an investigation that would unravel a complex conspiracy. On the morning of June 29, 2015, Teresa Sievers was discovered dead in her kitchen by a family friend. After Teresa failed to show up for work, Mark Sievers called Dr. Mark Petridis, the family friend, asking him to check on her. Upon entering the home using the garage code provided by Mark, Dr. Petridis found Teresa face down in a pool of blood, with a hammer lying next to her body. She was cold to the touch, and there were clear signs of a violent struggle. The brutal murder of Dr. Sievers sent shock waves through the Bonita Springs community. A well-respected physician and mother, her death left many in disbelief. Friends and patients expressed horror at the violence inflicted upon someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, marking a tragic loss for the community. After Teresa Sievers was found dead on June 29, 2015, law enforcement began their investigation. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, and colleagues to gather information about Teresa's life and any potential threats she may have faced. Investigators sought tips from the community, emphasizing the need for any information that could lead to identifying the perpetrator. They explored vigorous angles, including Teresa's professional relationships and personal life. Early in the investigation, attention turned to individuals who had interacted with Teresa or had grievances against her. However, no immediate leads emerged. Nearly 2 months after the murder, a significant breakthrough occurred when law enforcement received a tip from a source in Missouri. The tip indicated that Curtis Wayne Wright had confessed to someone about his involvement in Teresa's murder. Following the tip, detectives focused on Wright and his accomplice, Jimmy Roy Rogers. They traveled to Missouri to investigate further and gather evidence linking them to the crime. In August 2015, both Wright and Rogers were arrested in Missouri for their roles in Teresa's murder. The arrests were surprising to many as they were not local suspects. Their arrests followed a thorough investigation that uncovered critical evidence linking the two men to the crime. Police executed search warrants at their residences, where they collected various items that connected them to the murder, including clothing and other materials purchased shortly before Teresa's death. The investigation had gained momentum after detectives received a tip that led them to Wright. This information prompted a closer examination of his relationship with Mark Sievers, which raised suspicions about their potential involvement in a murder-for-hire scheme. The evidence collected during the arrest would later play a significant role in the trials of both men. Initially, Curtis Wayne Wright denied any involvement in Teresa's murder during police interrogations. However, as investigators presented evidence against him, he eventually crumbled and ended up confessing to his role in the crime. In his testimony, Wright detailed how Mark Sievers had approached him with the idea of killing Teresa during his wedding in May 2015, citing marital problems and financial motives. Wright admitted that he'd agreed to take care of it for at least $100,000 from Teresa's life insurance policy. He also implicated Jimmy Roy Rogers as his accomplice, describing how they planned and executed the murder together. This confession was pivotal in establishing Mark Sievers' involvement in orchestrating the murder plot, as Wright provided critical details about their communications and planning efforts leading up to the crime. In February 2016, he agreed to a plea deal with prosecutors to avoid facing a potential capital murder charge. Under the terms of the plea agreement, Wright confessed to his role in the murder and agreed to testify against his co-defendants, Mark Sievers and Jimmy Roy Rogers. In exchange for his cooperation, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder. This plea deal required that he provide substantial assistance to the prosecution throughout their cases against Sievers and Rogers. Wright's confession detailed how he and Rogers traveled from Missouri to Florida with the intent to kill Teresa as part of a plot orchestrated by Mark Sievers. He explained that Mark had approached them with the idea during his wedding in May 2015, citing financial difficulties and a desire to eliminate Teresa as a solution. The testimony was pivotal in establishing Mark's direct involvement in planning the murder. The outcomes of Wright's plea deal were significant. It not only secured a conviction against him, but also provided critical evidence that would lead to the eventual arrest and conviction of Mark Sievers. Wright's willingness to cooperate with law enforcement marked a turning point in the investigation, as his insights into the conspiracy illuminated the events leading up to Teresa's tragic death. In December 2015, after an extensive investigation into the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers, law enforcement arrested her husband, Mark Sievers. Detectives had been meticulously gathering evidence that linked Mark to the conspiracy to kill Teresa, which culminated in his arrest. The investigation revealed a series of text messages exchanged between Mark and Curtis Wayne Wright, which indicated a clear conspiracy to murder Teresa for financial gain. These messages outlined discussions about the murder plot and demonstrated Mark's direct involvement in orchestrating the crime. Prosecutors alleged that Mark had hired Wright and Jimmy Ray Rogers to carry out the killing, motivated by financial pressures and fears of losing custody of their daughters. Additionally, court documents released during this time highlighted troubling aspects of Mark and Teresa's marriage, including financial difficulties and potential infidelity. The evidence suggested that Mark stood to gain significantly from Teresa's life insurance policies, which totaled over $4 million across 5 separate policies. On December 4, 2015, shortly after Teresa's funeral, Mark was taken into custody. He was escorted by law enforcement from the Lee County Sheriff's Office wearing a red jumpsuit, with bonds set at $4.43 million. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events leading up to Teresa's murder, they expressed confidence that they had enough evidence to charge him with first-degree murder. Mark Sievers' arrest marked a significant turning point in the case, as it shifted focus onto him as a central figure in the conspiracy. His initial cooperation with investigators began to wane as the evidence against him mounted, leading to a complex legal battle that would unfold in the months to come. Following Mark Sievers' arrest in December 2015, investigators intensified their efforts to gather additional evidence related to the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers. A critical aspect of this ongoing investigation involved the analysis of digital evidence, particularly GPS data from the rental car used by Curtis Wayne Wright and Jimmy Ray Rogers during their trip from Missouri to Florida. Investigators obtained the GPS data, which provided a detailed account of the route taken by Wright and Rogers. This information was crucial in establishing a timeline of their movements leading up to the murder. The data confirmed that they departed Missouri on June 27, 2015, and arrived in Bonita Springs early on June 28, just hours before Teresa was killed. The precise timestamps indicated that they had arrived at the Sievers home around 6 a.m., aligning with the timeline of events surrounding Teresa's murder. In addition to the GPS data, investigators also analyzed cell phone records that revealed communications between Mark Sievers and Wright. These records indicated a pattern of contact leading up to the murder, further solidifying the connection between Mark and the conspiracy. The use of prepaid phones by Mark and Wright suggested an attempt to evade detection, but investigators were able to trace their communications effectively. The collection of this digital evidence played a significant role in cooperating witness testimonies and establishing a clear narrative of how the murder was planned and executed. As investigators continued to piece together the evidence, it became increasingly apparent that Mark Sievers had orchestrated the crime, leveraging his relationship with Wright and Rogers to carry out his intentions. This phase of evidence collection not only reinforced existing findings, but also laid the groundwork for subsequent legal proceedings against Mark Sievers, ultimately shaping the trajectory of the case as it moved toward trial. As preparations for the trial began, prosecutors focused on compiling a comprehensive body of evidence against both Curtis Wayne Wright and Mark Sievers. The significant piece of evidence came from surveillance footage captured at a local Walmart, where Wrights and Jimmy Ray Rogers were seen purchasing items that would later be linked to the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers. The footage showed the two men shopping with apparent disregard for concealing their identities, as they bought trash bags, flushable wet wipes, black towels, and a lot-picking kit. These purchases were critical in establishing their intent to commit murder and dispose of evidence afterward. In addition to the surveillance footage, investigators collected fibers from a blue jumpsuit discarded by Rogers along Highway 47 in Missouri. Forensic analysis revealed that these fibers matched those found on Teresa's clothing at the crime scene, providing a direct link between Rogers and the murder. This physical evidence bolstered the prosecution's case by demonstrating that both men had been present during the crime. The prosecution also gathered digital evidence, including GPS data found from the rental car used by Wright and Rogers. This data confirmed their route from Missouri to Florida and established a timeline of their movements leading up to Teresa's murder. The combination of digital footprints, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence created a robust case against the defendants. As the trial dates approached, the prosecution prepared to present this evidence in court, aiming to establish not only the guilt of Wright and Rogers, but also to demonstrate Mark Sievers' orchestrating role in planning his wife's murder. The evidence collected would be pivotal in shaping the narrative presented during these trials. Following the conviction of Jimmy Ray Rogers, Mark Sievers stood trial in December 2019. The prosecution once again prepared a case that relied heavily on the testimony of Curtis Wayne Wright, who had accepted a plea deal in exchange for his cooperation. Wright detailed how Mark orchestrated the murder plot, providing critical insights into the conspiracy that led to Teresa's death. During the trial, prosecutors presented various pieces of evidence linking Mark to the crime. This included text messages exchanged between Mark and Wright that indicated discussions about the murder and financial motivations behind it. The prosecution argued that Mark's desire for financial gain from Teresa's life insurance policies was a primary motive for orchestrating her murder. The defense countered by asserting that there was no credible evidence directly connecting Mark to the actual murder. They emphasized that the state had only proven that Wright and Rogers, not Mark, were responsible for Teresa's death. The defense focused on discrediting Wright's testimony by highlighting its criminal background, which included multiple felony convictions and a history of mental health issues, including bipolar disorder. They argued that Wright had a motive to fabricate his story in order to secure a more lenient sentence for himself. Additionally, the defense theorized that Wright might have been influenced by law enforcement during his interrogation, suggesting he was simply parroting a narrative fed to him by investigators. They pointed out that Wright had not undergone a polygraph examination, which they argued could have validated or undermined his credibility as a witness. The defense concluded their arguments by urging jurors to question whether they could trust Wright's statements and to consider the lack of direct evidence linking Mark to the crime. As the trial progressed, jurors were presented with the same forensic evidence, including fibers from a blue jumpsuit that Rogers had discarded that matched those found on Teresa's body. Despite this evidence, the defense maintained its position that Mark Sievers was not involved in planning or executing the murder. On December 4, 2019, after a brief deliberation of approximately 4 hours, the jury found Mark Sievers guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The verdict was based on overwhelming evidence that linked him to both the planning and execution of Teresa's murder. The jury's decision reflected their assessment of the evidence presented during the trial, including the motive and financial gains from Teresa's life insurance policy. The prosecution effectively demonstrated that Mark had not only planned the murder, but had also recruited Wright and Rogers to carry out his intentions. Following the verdict, Mark Sievers faced a sentencing phase, where jurors would determine his punishment. The outcome of this phase would depend on whether they found aggravated factors that warranted a death sentence, or if mitigating circumstances could lead to a lesser penalty. Following his conviction for first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, a sentencing phase for Mark Sievers took place where jurors considered aggravating factors related to the crime. This phase began on December 11, 2019, shortly after the verdict was delivered. The prosecution sought to establish two primary aggravating factors: that the murder was committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner, and that it was carried out for a pecuniary gain. The state presented evidence from the trial, including Curtis Wayne Wright's testimony about Mark's orchestration of the murder and the financial motivations behind it. Additionally, victim impact statements were introduced to convey the emotional toll of Teresa's murder on her family and community. The defense aimed to present mitigating evidence, highlighting Mark's lack of prior criminal record and his relationships with his daughters. Family members testified about his role as a father and husband, portraying him in a positive light. However, they faced a challenge in countering the strong evidence presented by the prosecution. On January 3, 2020, after deliberation, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty for Mark Sievers. They found that the aggravating factor of cold, calculated premeditation was proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but did not find sufficient evidence to support the pecuniary gain factor. During the sentencing hearing, Mark Sievers addressed the court, maintaining his innocence and expressing his love for Teresa and their daughters. He requested that he be spared from the death penalty. Despite his pleas and the defense's arguments for leniency, Judge Bruce Kyle ultimately sentenced him to death for orchestrating Teresa's murder. The court emphasized the weight of the jury's recommendation and noted that Sievers' actions demonstrated a complete disregard for human life. In addition to the death sentence for first-degree murder, he received a consecutive 30-year prison sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. The sentencing phase concluded with Mark Sievers facing significant legal challenges ahead, as he planned to appeal both his conviction and sentence. As of now, Mark Sievers remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Florida while appealing his conviction and sentence. Following his sentencing on January 3, 2020, Sievers has maintained his innocence, asserting that he did not orchestrate his wife Teresa's murder. His legal team claims to have new evidence that could potentially clear his name. This includes a letter from Jimmy Ray Rogers, the third man involved in the murder plot, in which he allegedly states that Sievers was innocent and had no part in the crime. Sievers' attorney had filed motions to overturn his sentence, arguing that this new evidence could have influenced the jury's decision during both the conviction and penalty phases of the trial. However, the state of Florida has expressed confidence in its case, asserting that the evidence presented at trial was strong enough to uphold Sievers' conviction. Legal experts remain skeptical about whether this new evidence will be sufficient to warrant a retrial, given the substantial evidence linking him to the crime. The Florida Supreme Court is expected to rule on Sievers' appeal in the coming months. Do you think a letter from Rogers is enough to prove Mark's innocence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.